All right, thank you so much for, I don't know how you follow Brian. That's, maybe I'll curse a lot. Hopefully that will wake folks up. All right, so I'm Dave Zwieback, and I work for this incredible company in New York City called Next Big Sound. We've built an analytics software for the music industry and other industries as well. I'm not going to talk about that too much. I could for a long time. See me afterwards. I am here to talk about cognitive biases and stress and the effects that these things have on outages and postmortems, right? So let's get right into it. This is the world's oldest postmortem, public one at that. So that's in the caves in France. It's about 17,000 years old. What you see, right, it didn't end so well for the fellow, that Birdman. So he's clearly dead. The bison doesn't seem to be doing too well either, with the guts spilling out. So that much we can tell. But, you know, there's a lot of debate about what actually is depicted here. And there's a minority of archaeologists who think that what's depicted here is a small number of instances in a single availability zone. There's something very human about looking at disasters. You know, we write songs about it. We certainly can't help staring at them. You know, there's poetry, there's architecture, there's, you know, monuments and sculpture and all those kinds of things. And I think there's something very evolutionary necessary about it. Like, we need to learn from our mistakes, right, from these kinds of disasters in order to survive individually and as a species, right? And so, how many of you actually here do postmortems after, like, outages? Most of you. How many of you publish them openly, like, for everybody to see? See, that's really amazing. Yeah, some. That's really amazing, and that's really awesome, because not only we can learn from our mistakes, right, but also from the mistakes of others. This makes, you know, a whole community more resilient, and it's something that really is fairly new in our industry, but something to be definitely celebrated. Now, if you read these postmortems as much as I do, you start to see patterns. And basically, you know, what a normal postmortem looks like is, you know, there's an apology. It's like, sorry, we took down, you know, the service. It happened. There's some kind of an explanation about, like, what actually happened, the reason for the downtime, maybe the root cause, and then, you know, here's what we're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. So that's really good. You know, it's kind of acknowledging the pink elephant in the room, so to speak. What you do also notice is that all these postmortems are fairly linear in the way that they present this information. It's like, well, this happened, and it looks kind of very neat and perfect. And if you've ever actually been through an outage, it's more like this. You know, you've got information that's coming from all over the place. It's definitely not linear. You know, and the paths you go down to find the root cause, if you can even find one, you know, some of them are dead ends. And, you know, outages are messy, and the postmortem write-ups don't really reflect that very well. I mean, the other thing that's kind of glaring is, if you read a postmortem, it's like, where are all the people? Where are the people that, you know, contributed to the outage? Where are the people that helped resolve it? So because the people are missing, I kind of enlisted the help of some monkeys to talk about this stuff, the human stuff that's missing from these postmortem investigations and write-ups. First and most obvious one is stress. When was the last time that you read a postmortem that said something like, we couldn't get the service back online as quickly as possible because we were all, you know, under tremendous amounts of stress? Happens. What about we tried the same thing that worked in the last X number of outages, but didn't work this time, and that's why it took us longer to bring the service back online. Does that ever happen? Is it any postmortem? Some. So this is cognitive biases. So like, for instance, the recency bias and sunk cost bias and things like that. We'll talk a little bit about it later on. How about this? We didn't communicate openly during the outage because we thought that we were going to get fired. I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but I know this happens. We don't talk about it. And so because of all this stuff, because the human sort of element is missing, right, and the way that the information is presented in these postmortems, like it kind of makes these write-ups kind of like docufiction, you know? It's not quite documentary, it's not quite fictional, somewhere in between. So if you're going to do that, you might as well like have a movie about it. And so if there's a movie about the outages that I participated in, I request that Brad Pitt play me. I think there's like he's got the requisite amount of good looks and melancholy, enough for like an ops guy. Now, I don't want to paint everything with the same brush. There are places where the human element is being acknowledged. So this is an excerpt from Hiroko's postmortem, and this is from a master, Mark Imbriaco. And there's a couple of things that are notable here. First of all, we know that outages are like these all hands affairs, right? Like, just get the shit back online. And what he's saying is that they actually put in place, a process, a procedure to make sure that people are fresh. They're putting people first. That's something very, very notable. Not something that actually a lot of people in our industry do. Okay? Second is that the fact, this whole concept of incident commander, right, it comes from emergency management, and that's also something that's important because he's taking information and things that other industries have learned and applying it here. We've only been doing this for about 20 years. Emergency management's been around for maybe 40, 50 years. There's a lot that we can learn here. And you guys remember Gene Kranz, right? The people needed to sleep, and they explicitly worked that into the schedule. Okay? And there's a reason for that. So let's sort of dig in a little bit into this stress business. I think we all have kind of a good, gut level understanding of like what stress is, right? But actually we can distinguish two types. If you are being chased by a tiger, that fight or flight response that you will have is a result of absolute stress, okay? Everybody has it. It's pretty uniform for most humans. Okay, not a lot you can do about it. It's kind of instinctive. It certainly has preserved the species to a certain extent really well. But there's other types of stress. For instance, talking in front of people is actually a relative stressor. In fact, according to one survey, or several surveys, it's actually scarier and more stressful than death. So if you're at a funeral, you'd rather be dead than giving a eulogy. And so so this is relative stress. It's not as consistent for all people, but it's there, it's measurable. You can definitely see the results of it on humans. And there are four relative stressors that actually reliably cause stress. So if you're in an unusual and novel situation, if there's something going on that's unpredictable, if you feel like you don't have full control over the situation, and also if you feel like you might be judged negatively for doing something or not doing something. Does that sound like every outage ever? So people have been studying stress for a long time. These two social scientists, Yerkes and Dodson, they established this relationship between stress and performance, decision-making, and so on, back in 1908. They did this through some less than humane experiments with mice, but since that time, these relationships have been proven in sort of extraordinarily wide a range of circumstances. This holds true. So I'll spend a minute here because it's a pretty important thing. So the first thing you note about stress is that it actually helps performance up to a certain point, right? So when you first wake up, and this is before your first cup of coffee or shower or whatever, like that's probably not your best decision making of the day. Maybe for some people, definitely not for me. But what you see is at a certain point, it is individual for each person. You know, there's a peak, and then there's a pretty sharp drop off. And so that's why you see, like, for instance, athletes, right? When they're kind of getting themselves ready to run a sprint or something like that, they may be like jumping up and down, they're listening to like loud music in their headphones. They're basically trying to get themselves into that optimum zone. They're putting a little stress on themselves, not too much. Nobody knows exactly how much is enough, but that's the reason they're doing it. But that's very different. Like if you're an athlete and you're listening to, like, you know, Enter Sandman by Metallica, you know, to try to get yourself, you know, there, it's very different than if you're in Guantanamo and, you know, like that same song is being played at top volume 24 hours a day. Okay, that's used to basically break a person down. All right, it's the same kind of thing. So that's sort of what I'm talking about there. So the other thing is, and this is often overlooked about the Yerkes-Dodson law, is that there's a distinction between complex tasks and simple tasks. And so what's a simple task? Like, what's the capital of France? You don't have to do anything. It's just there. And you can keep doing this whether or not it's 2 o'clock in the morning or 5 o'clock in the morning or whatever amount of stress you're under. But if I ask you, like, what's a complex task? How about, you know, fixing an outage? It's pretty complex, you know? So you see that the simple tasks are a lot more resilient to stress. So the good news, though, is that you can move complex tasks to become simpler, and we'll talk about it in a second as well. So we talked about, you know, relative stress, absolute stress. How do we actually measure it? Like, what do we do about it? Well, you could do that, cortisone levels. So we have this concept of stress surface. And it's similar to attack surface for those of you who sort of deal with security. And basically, it's a measure of the extent to which an outage contained, you know, these 4 relative stressors that we talked about. You know, the situation being novel, unpredictable, lack of control, and sort of that socially evaluative stress, being judged negatively by others, possibility of it, okay? And so it's a very kind of, the way that I do it is, I send out a survey, like a Google Docs or Google Apps survey, so that there's no group kind of bias. And, you know, I ask these questions on a scale of 1 to 10, and I collate the answers, I average them, I calculate the standard deviation. Nothing terribly complicated, right? And you get a score. And so the score is really a relative measure, right? So if you have one outage versus another, you can compare the scores. More interestingly than the overall score, you can compare the components. Like, hey, how come this outage, you know, felt more novel than this one? Or what was so unpredictable about this one versus that one? Right? So you can start to have these kinds of conversation. And so I do this as part of the normal sort of postmortem process. Just calculate that score, write it down so it's there. And the thing that you also get from capturing this information is that you could see if the things that you're doing to reduce the effects of stress on your outages are actually working, right? And so what are those things that you can do to actually reduce the stress surface, which is to say the effect that stress will have on decision-making during outages? Well, of course, you know, you can practice. So with practice, as we saw, right, one of the things that happens is that complex tasks become simpler. If you go back to the time when you first learned how to drive, right, you're probably sitting very straight, You know, radio off, windows up, you're not talking to anybody, you know. You know, fast forward 6 months, windows down, radio blasting, one hand, you're texting or talking on the phone, talking to your friend at the same time, right? So it is possible. You know, driving is extraordinarily complex, but with practice, it actually becomes like second nature, totally automatic. Until, of course, you come to like a busy intersection and you turn down the volume and you get all tense again. So, you know, game day exercises, look, we know how to do this kind of stuff. There's nothing new here. But the reason to do it, right, to reduce stress, to improve decision making. You get this particular thing for free if you run an AWS, or if you use, you know, Netflix Simian Army and all that. But consciously sort of breaking stuff is a great way to learn, to get more familiarity with the components, and sort of things become less novel, less unpredictable, and so on. When things do go wrong, obviously conducting postmortems, and you guys seem to all be doing that, which is great. Publishing those results and kind of analyzing them, really making sure people understand what went down is awesome. And also doing it publicly almost as a community service. It's very, very commendable. So you mentioned cortisol levels and all that. So people have started to, you know, there's a lot of biometrics and stuff available. People actually, in one experiment, attached like some kind of biometric monitors to traders, like stock traders. And when their stress level, as measured by this thing, went too high, it would actually prevent them from trading. You know? So we're a little ways off, I think, from that kind of technology, but probably not too far off. And there's a lot of research in this area. It's very fruitful. But even before we get there, just doing simple things like, hey, we have a rotation. It's 6 hours, or it's 8 hours, or it's 4 hours. You know, so when shit hits the fan, we know what the rotation is and how we're going to cycle people in and out to make sure that they get enough rest is equally as important. So when I was measuring the stress surface, what's kind of really interesting is that, so there's 4 components, right? And there's one component that changed very little from outage to outage to outage. And you can probably guess which one. It's the one that's associated with basically the threat of being negatively evaluated. And so within a single company, unless something is being done to address that, it's kind of going to stay at the same level, more or less. So that's interesting. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about like blameless postmortems and so on. And mostly it's been sort of in the context of like, well, this is what, you know, forward-thinking, people-first type of companies do. My argument is that if you actually want, you know, less outages, less frequent outages, and the duration of the outages to shrink, if you want people to make better decisions in these kinds of situations, you have to also address your culture. That last bit, the social evaluative of stress, has everything to do with how much blame and shame there's going on in the company. Like how much a person can become a root cause of an outage, and how much that person can be, you know, remediated out of a job as a result of an outage. So it's pretty hard, and the way that, you know, I mean, culture change is very, very difficult. The way that I start my postmortems, and you guys won't let me lie, right? I repeat this kind of verbatim almost, like, if we get to the point where a person or a group of people are the root cause of an outage, we're not digging deeply enough. I'm just saying it over and over again at the beginning of every postmortem. You know, just like getting it out of the way. And that helps. It's not magic, though. So the stress surface business, there's a couple of things. So first of all, I didn't just make it up. It's based on this psychological tool called the perceived stress scale, which is used pretty widely in psychology to evaluate, you know, how stressed people are. Now, if you look at those studies, they have a fairly high variance The data has fairly high variance. And it's understandable because basically what you're asking is for people to remember how they felt in the past. Right? How often did you think or feel this way? So there's some variance there. And also if your team is pretty small, right, and so the people affected by the outage who you're polling to get the stress surface number, you might not have essentially enough people. You might have a small sample size, right? So you might not get statistically significant results. Even so, as I mentioned, having this stress surface number, especially having the components and being able to talk about it is extremely useful. Like, why was this outage especially novel? And have a conversation about that. It gives you a way to sort of frame the conversation. So that's stress. And the next bit, I'd like to talk a little bit about cognitive biases. So that's the other thing that really affects our thinking, especially during stressful situations, but in general. And instead of kind of talking about it too much, I'd like to demonstrate to you. So it turns out we have two types of thinking that goes on. So when I ask you this question, the answer came quickly, effortlessly, and immediately, right? In fact, there's probably nothing you could do to keep it from arising in your mind, right? Just there. So this is something that's called System 1 thinking. Okay? And it's very fast, it's based on memory or experience, and it's effortless. And it's really awesome, because that's the type of thinking, and actually, like, when you call somebody you know really well on the phone, and you hear their voice, for just 2 seconds, you already know what their mood is and if they're feeling bad or good or whatever. If I ask you this question, on the other hand, anybody? Okay, so unless you're exceptionally, good at like mental math or something, this is much more effortful, will take a long time. And the answer, by the way, is 39,636. I have to look it up. So this is System 2 thinking. It's slow. It's effortful. And actually, System 2 thinking uses up more glucose in the brain. So since we're kind of like a energy-conserving organism, right, we kind of want to hang out in the System 1 thinking as much as we possibly can. And it's pretty good. The one thing I want to say is that System 1 and System 2 thinking is not like left brain, right brain. Like they both happen at the same time. One is definitely not better than the other, right? System 1 is in no way, shape, or form worse or somehow less than System 2 thinking. They're just different. One is fast, kind of like memory-based. The other is analytical, slower. One is kind of cheap and good at approximations. The other is more analytical, more exact. Now, there's a whole book that's dedicated to System 1 thinking. It's called Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. It's a really great read, recommend it. And so this is an example from that book. The Getty Museum purchased an artifact, and it came with all kinds of documentation and authenticity, kind of certificates and things. And then when expert archaeologists went to look at this artifact, they kind of looked at it and very quickly said, it's fake. And then they couldn't really answer why. They didn't know exactly. But like, gut feeling, it's fake. And so that's one of the shortcomings of System 1 thinking. It's also one of its powers. So these guys have been, the people that could see that it was fake, and in fact it was, it turned out to be, they had many, many years of experience in archaeology. And they could take in this whole thing and make a very quick snap decision based on their experience, based on their memory. Gene Kranz talked about this, right? Like, do you return the craft home directly or do you go around the moon? Gut feeling, quick decision. Based on what? Based on many, many years of experience. You and I put in that position, we couldn't make that decision. We walk into the museum, we look at it, I don't know, looks okay to me, it's in the museum, so it must be real, not fake. So again, that's both the power and the shortcoming of System 1 thinking, is that its ability to make really quick decisions based on experience. But, so I'll give you a minute here. This is one of the 3 questions on the cognitive reflection test. And the questions there are selected because they very reliably produce very quick and incorrect answers. If you answered 100, you're in really good company, because 90% of Princeton students answered one of these 3 questions on the test, including this one, incorrectly. The correct answer is 5. So this is System 1 thinking in action. It's quick, and it feels good, right? 5, 5, 5, 100, 100, 100. Okay, good, done. Wrong. So that's another kind of thing that we need to know about System 1 thinking. You could say it's a shortcoming, is that there are situations where it will be reliably, quickly wrong. Okay? Basically what's happening is that thinking relies on sort of mental shortcuts, heuristics, and the result of them are what we call cognitive biases. Okay? So that's what a cognitive bias, you just experienced it. And they all live in System 1 thinking, by the way. The System 2 thinking, the analytical one, is more or less free of them. There's lots of them. And this is a field that's really kind of rich in research right now, and I think this number is going to keep expanding. Really awesome kind of book dedicated to these. You know, it weighs in 500 pages. There's a lot to discuss. You know, we're talking about how our mind works, really. So instead of talking about it too much again, I want to kind of show you how they work. And I've picked a couple of biases, of these cognitive biases, that are especially present during outages and postmortems, right? So that we can learn to recognize them, and maybe we could do something about them. So this one is kind of probably the most studied of all, hindsight bias. And so imagine you're in 1999, right? And so Google, at that point, has raised $100,000, and the co-founders decided that they want to go back to school to complete their studies. True story. And so they started shopping the company around. They went to Yahoo, they went to Excite. Obviously, they didn't sell, because we know the outcome. But my question to you is, how much do you think Google was worth? How much were they trying to sell it for in 1999? Guesses. 5 million? 1 million? 1 million? $250,000? 500,000? Really? Wow. Okay. Anybody else? $1 billion. What, do you work for Facebook or something? So I checked a few days ago, and Google is almost a $300 billion company today. Does this change your estimate? Do you guys, anybody want to change your estimate? 500, 5 million?
3 million.
It actually went down. Holy shit. Anybody else? Want to venture a guess? 100 million? Awesome. So then there's this company, which I don't know, was sold for almost $1 billion. Just giving you more data, right? Data that we have today to sort of see. So it turns out you're actually not that far off. Google went to Yahoo, tried to sell themselves for $1 million. Yahoo turned them down. Then they went to Excite. Do you remember that company? Me either. They went to Excite. Excite turned them down for $750,000, right? Like they lowered the price. So what you just experienced that thinking of like, holy shit, those guys were like, who turns down buying Google? Those guys are idiots, right? That's hindsight bias, because you're basically looking back with the benefit of information you have now to a past decision. This information was obviously, the valuation of Google was obviously not available at the time. Now, not just sort of us casual observers are subject to this bias. So Paul Graham is one of the most successful and investors of our time. Certainly one of the most vocal. And this is another example of hindsight bias. And so, how this comes up in outages, right? It's actually pretty easy to spot. Anytime that you hear somebody say, oh, I should have known that, or I should have done that, or she or he should have done this and that, that should have is a dead giveaway for hindsight bias. And when you hear it, you can challenge it. Be like, did we really have this information at the time when we were making this decision? Right? So this helps, with the blaming and shaming, but also like to be realistic about what kind of decision making happens in these kinds of stressful situations. So these biases, they kind of travel in packs a lot of times, and hindsight bias is often accompanied by outcome bias. And it goes roughly like this. Basically, we judge the person positively or negatively to the extent that the outcome was positive or negative. So in my previous example, with judging, kind of saying, these Excite people were insane, right? To turn down Google, what were they thinking? We're in addition to hindsight bias, outcome bias is also present, because we're judging those folks, basically calling them idiots, because the outcome was so negative. Excite, who even knows about Excite? And Google is a $300 billion company. And this also obviously happens during postmortems and during outages. So imagine the situation, right? You're an engineer, and you do something, somewhat reckless, maybe something in production without backup, and in one case, nothing happens, no outage. In fact, maybe something good happens. In another case, you took the site down, it takes 5 hours to recover, etc. So this is how usually the postmortems go for these kinds of things. The first one is like, hey, should just be more careful next time. Like, don't do this shit, right? Kind of like a slap on the wrist. The second case, right, and it's the same action, just different outcome, is going to be, well, that was reckless, that was negligent, we need to make sure you can't do this anymore, you can't have permission to do these things in production anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same thing. What's worse, sometimes these kind of risky actions that turn out to be good, we actually make heroes out of the people that do them. Oh, wow, that guy was a visionary. He took his team on a death march. Half of them quit afterwards, but we met the deadline. And then, oh, let's promote that guy. This happens. And that's because of outcome bias. You might be wondering, what's the extent to which we're swayed by this, right? Can you give me some data? Can you show me, is this a little bit? Well, so there's an experiment. So there's a bridge somewhere in Minnesota, and when debris sort of collects under it, the surrounding area gets flooded, and there's damage and so on. So they asked two groups of people the same question. Would you hire a full-time bridge monitor? Basically a person to just be there and to see if the debris is collecting, and when it does, kind of get it out of the way. Okay? So same question, two groups of people. And the difference is the second group of people, they also said that there was some flooding recently that caused some damage. And it reminded them that this happens occasionally. And so what do you think are the differences between these two groups? Any guesses?
For the first group, it was 15% positive pro-decision, and the second was about 95% pro-decision.
15 Pro versus 95. Okay. Anybody else want to venture guesses? That seems about right. Reasonable?
I don't know these people. I don't know how much damage.
Who are these people? Oh, right. Well, you're one of those data people, aren't you?
Yeah.
So it turns out that the difference is pretty staggering. That's double. More than double. Okay? Kicker is, to that second group, they also said, hey, there are these things called cognitive biases. There's this thing called hindsight bias. You will be swayed by it. Don't be swayed by it. The second group knew about hindsight bias. It's a lot.
But there's also another effect in action because our subconscious doesn't hear do not.
Our subconscious does not hear, do not.
Does not. Which means
Oh.
if you go down the hey, don't think about pink elephants.
Don't think about pink elephants.
I will think about pink elephants all night long.
Yeah. Well, okay. Hey, to each his own. Pink elephants, fantastic. I cannot really, I mean, not my thing, but hey. So it's true. And what's interesting about cognitive biases, it's a lot easier to recognize them in other people. It's incredibly difficult to recognize them in oneself. So this is kind of a known thing. Okay. There's another one. That's a goodie. Also shows up in outages and postmortems a lot. So this is also called sometimes recency bias. On the East Coast, we sometimes have power outages, not too frequently. You know, our grid is more or less okay. But when we do have power outages, right, it's like a big event. It's top of news, and it's just like you hear a lot about it. So as a result, a lot of people have backup generators, gas-powered backup generators. A lot. Like on my block, probably, I don't know, 60 or 70% of the people have them. And we had Sandy, which in addition to power outages, which were kind of long, we also had gas shortages. And guess how many people stockpiled gas in their garages? Like nobody, right? And again, you look back, you know, hindsight bias, like, oh shit, what was I thinking, right? But the thing is this, so I looked this up. According to the census, like 50% of the people, half of our population was born after 1975. Certainly makes me feel old, but that's beside the point. And the last time that we had, you know, gas outages that had to do with the whole OPEC business, basically, most of the people never experienced them in their lifetime. So that's like one of the reasons why you'd never think that you need to stockpile gas, because there's always gas. And so this, you know, this happens kind of actually all the time. For instance, like, we think that we're more likely to die from tornadoes than asthma, because there's a lot of coverage of tornadoes, for instance, in the news, and not so much of asthma. In fact, you're 20 times more likely to die from asthma than from a tornado. Okay? So this recency bias, this availability thing, that thing that's kind of on your top of mind, how it shows up in outages is, the last time that the Amazon outage was, what was the cause? ELB. No, EBS. EBS, right? So that the next time there's an Amazon outage, what's the first thing you check? EBS. Okay? Now, it might be true, but all you're doing is you're just, whatever's top of mind, that's the first thing you try. And sometimes you keep trying and trying and trying without really much effect, because so we've made a lot of progress in terms of standardizing the way that our systems are you know, look, you know, through configuration management. But outages are still gloriously unique. They're like snowflakes, you know? They're independent events. And because they're independent events, what worked the last time is not necessarily going to work the next time. So there's, as I said, there's like 177 of these biases. I could spend, I don't know, a long time, let's say, talking about them. And if this is something that's interesting to you, just find me afterwards. We'll have a bath or something like that. But the key point, so there's many of them. There's lots to talk about. But the key point is that, remember we talked about system 1 and system 2 thinking? Cognitive biases live exclusively, they're a function of system 1 thinking, of that quick, error-prone, gut feeling thinking. Okay? And so how does that actually help us? Well, it's very difficult, as I mentioned, to recognize cognitive biases in ourselves. Almost impossible. But when we encounter situations which are risky for some reason or another, for instance, during an outage, or when we're rolling out new software, or things like that, we can actually purposefully slow ourselves down, slow our thinking down. So purposefully invoke system 2 thinking, okay? That will help us a lot. That's one of the ways you basically fight cognitive biases, the effects of them. So very specifically, what you could do if you are about to do something that's risky is conduct a premortem. So we spent a lot of time talking about postmortems, and the premortem is sort of what it sounds like. Basically, like you give collect the people that would be working on it, give them a bunch of stickies, and you say, this thing that we're about to do, that upgrade, or this new feature that we're about to roll out, or this maintenance we're about to do, it failed. We're fast forward 24 hours, it's done, it's horrible. I mean, it's so bad, it's on the front page of like the New York Times, okay? And so, what happened? And then so each individual that kind of scurry and write down the things, oh, we forgot to back up this, or we don't have this person, available, or we don't know how this part works, etc. And a lot of stuff comes out, a lot of really useful things. And you can actually sometimes choose not to go ahead with that thing that you were going to do because, like, hey, we didn't think about that. And this is really, really more risk than we can take. So these premortems, actually, they help, they increase your ability to predict outcomes by 30%. I don't know about you, but I'll take 30% any day. It's really powerful stuff. I love that phrase, prospective hindsight. So another way that we can slow things down a little bit is to ask a lot of questions, during an outage. These are the questions you can ask. Or when you're about to do something. What could possibly go wrong from doing this? I'm going to reboot the server. What could possibly go wrong? And the most important one of all questions is probably this. It's how do I know that? So when you're in a really highly stressful situation, there's all this information coming in, and you have to make split-second decisions. And for some of them, and this information is coming, and you make a decision, but how do I know that? How do I know this is going to work, or it's not going to work? And talking to somebody really helps in that too. Again, what you're trying to do here is very purposefully invoke the system 2 thinking, the analytical, the slow, the one that produces much less errors than system 1. So we talked about cognitive biases a little bit. We talked about stress a little bit. And the one thing that unites them is the fact that they're all kind of, to a large extent, mental phenomena. They have to do a lot with our mind. They have to do a lot with our thinking. So isn't there anything that we can do to sort of address both of these things? Isn't there some way that we can work with our thinking directly or with the mind? And so it turns out that there is. There's been a lot of research onto mindfulness-based stress reduction. It works. It reduces stress. Proven, clinically proven, as they say. No side effects. No software upgrade required. Chemical-free, all that. And so this is what, what I'd like for us as an industry to get to is, including the human element in the way that we work, obviously. And mindful ops is sort of that. How does it work? How does mindfulness work? So you take a jar, you fill it with sparkles, because after all, we're all sparkly coat princesses here. And you shake it up, and you try to look through it. It's opaque, can't see anything. If you let it rest, just set it down, let it rest, after a few minutes, it will become clear. So actually, that's sort of like how meditation works. You sit down, you do nothing for a while, and your mind becomes, your thinking becomes clear. Okay? Can I demonstrate? All right, so mindfulness meditation, no side effects, right? Not dangerous, not religious or anything. Okay, so you sit straight, comfortably. You don't have to like cross your legs and all that. You could, if that's your thing. Straighten your back as much as possible, but you don't have to be too rigid about it. Eyes open, but not kind of wide open, also not falling asleep. That's a different kind of meditation. Mouth open a little bit. You're breathing through your mouth. And you're looking kind of sort of like here and a little bit in front of you, really softly focused, not on anything in particular. Hands like this or like this, doesn't really matter which way. And what you're paying attention to is your breath. By the way, you could do this with me if you're so inclined. And when your mind, when you start thinking about something else, something other than the breath, like shoe shopping, or, that outage, just gently return your attention to the breath. That's about it. Do you guys have any questions? Anybody awake?
On one of your very early slides, you had this sort of fear chart.
Mm.
Do you know why it was in 1993 that it seems like we're all hella more scared of everything? Because every single line was 10% higher in 1993 than it was in 1973.
Really?
It was slide 8 or something. It was quite a while back.
Oh, there it is.
There it is.
You're right.
Yeah, so I guess we're all horrified at everything there.
Sounds like it. Well, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's the media myself.
The media.
Yeah. I wouldn't have normally been afraid of heights, but if I read articles about people falling to their deaths, that starts to pick it up.
And then after you read the articles about people falling to their death, you start to think that's a very likely event.
Yep.
Yeah, probably more likely than being hit by a bus or something.
There's actually quite a bit of research that shows stuff like that. The odds of you being impacted by, say, terrorism, because most of the research is about that right now, is actually incredibly low. Meanwhile, you being in a car accident is incredibly high, and people are spending tons of money on terrorism and not spending any money on safety equipment for automobiles. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, that's cognitive biases in action. One of the cognitive biases is basically really a deep misunderstanding of statistics of probability, of the relative probability of things and events.
They're not able to internalize that.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, we're just not built for it.
Yep, that's exactly right.
What are your thoughts on burnout? Does one prevent burnout? I'm thinking across the organization, not just within ops.
sure. So the question is, how do you prevent burnout? Okay. First of all, once you have burnout, there's basically nothing you can do. Like it's almost impossible to recover. Like you leave the company. That's basically what happens. Or your productivity, basically leave the company, physically or mentally. You check out. So in terms of preventing it, you have to have folks that ring the alarm when it looks like, a death march is imminent, or, yeah, that's basically it. Unfortunately, I don't have any other things. And you also have to have kind of management that actually listens and says, oh no, okay. If you as a company, right, so for instance, gaming companies are kind of known for you join the gaming company, you're going to work here for 18 months, and you're going to work 100 hours a week, and that's just it. And you're going to be burnt out, but that's just like it. And so, it's not ideal, but I think people who join gaming companies, generally speaking, they know about this, and it's their choice. Other companies can make a statement saying like, we do not, as a rule, do death marches. We'd rather let the deadline slip than have our people work 80 hours a week. And if it's in the culture, then it won't happen. Yeah. Anybody else? All right. Thank you very much.